It all began at my aunt's place. She lives in a quaint old farmhouse that creaks under the slightest shift in the wind. The entire family had gathered there for a reunion, the sort of event marked by too much food, too many drinks, and a confusing tapestry of relationships. Aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone bickered and embraced in equal measure. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the living room was a battleground of board games and half-empty wine bottles. I'd arrived that afternoon full of anticipation, seeing relatives I hadn't caught up with in years, telling the usual jokes, politely dodging questions about when I'd settled down. The day flew by in a blur of laughter and conversation. Around dinner, Uncle Dave tried to share a local legend about some ghostly presence in the nearby woods. "Old roads, old secrets," he said, swirling his glass. I only half listened, figuring it was another tall tale to entertain the cousins. If only I'd paid closer attention. By 10 p.m., many guests had already retired to spare rooms or unrolled sleeping bags in the den. But not me. I had to leave. Work obligations demanded that I be at my desk the next morning, bright and early. Aunt Linda offered me a couch, but I declined. "I'll be fine," I said confidently. "It's just a 2-hour drive." If only I'd known what waited for me out there. The sky was draped in a moonless shroud of darkness. Even the stars seemed dimmer than usual, obscured by a veil of clouds that promised a storm. As I hugged my aunt goodbye, I felt an odd chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was as though an invisible thread tugged at me, urging me to stay put. But responsibilities weighed heavier, and so I stepped out onto the porch, keys jangling in my hand, and hurried to my car. The initial stretch of the drive was deceptively calm. Streetlights still glowed in the outskirts of the small town, illuminating shuttered shops and a single gas station. I contemplated stopping for coffee but decided against it. If I kept driving, I'd reach the highway soon enough, where I'd definitely find a 24-hour convenience store. Or so I thought. Eventually, streetlights became fewer and far between. I drove past fields empty except for silhouettes of grazing cattle, the occasional farmhouse windows glowing with the final vestiges of the day. Then, as if crossing an invisible threshold, I entered a region choked by tall, ancient pines. They leaned over the winding road, branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. It felt claustrophobic, like driving through a tunnel carved out of living wood. And that's when I first noticed the fatigue, a sudden, oppressive weariness that made my head loll forward. It wasn't the mild exhaustion you feel after a long day. This slammed into me like a sledgehammer. My eyes threatened to close, and my brain buzzed with an unsettling static, as though something was nudging me to sleep, right there in the car. I turned on the radio, hoping for a jolt of energy from music or even late-night talk shows. Static. Pure, grating static. I twisted the dial, but every station spat the same white noise. An uneasy sensation crawled up my spine. The radio had worked fine earlier that day. There was no reason for it to malfunction now. A fleeting thought, maybe the area was so remote that radio signals just couldn't penetrate. But why did the static sound so alive? As I fiddled with the volume, I could almost discern a voice in that hiss, whispering at the edge of hearing. I dismissed it as my tired mind playing tricks. Then I realized how deserted the road was. I hadn't seen another car in 20 minutes, no headlights behind me, no oncoming traffic. It was as if the entire world ended beyond those walls of trees, leaving me alone in a corridor of blackness. A quick glance at my dashboard clock told me it was 11:15 p.m. An unease pooled in my gut. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, eager to reach the main highway, but the more I drove, the more the road twisted, as if intentionally leading me deeper into the woods. My eyelids grew heavy, fighting to close. Pinching my thigh didn't help, rolling down the windows for fresh air didn't help. The wind that rushed in carried an earthy, decaying smell, a moldy odor that made me cough. Where was the crisp night air? The forest seemed to exhale a foul breath, sapping what little alertness remained in me. At about 11:22 p.m., that soul-shaking fatigue became undeniable. My vision blurred, and I swerved slightly, my tires grazing the road's shoulder. Pine needles scattered, and the car jerked back onto the asphalt. My heart pounded. I can't keep driving like this, I thought. I'll crash. But there was no friendly rest stop or illuminated gas station. I spotted a narrow patch of grass off to the side, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. Common sense told me that pulling over in such an isolated area was a terrible idea. But I felt I had no other option. My body was at its limit. Trying to inch farther seemed more dangerous than taking a short nap. So, against every instinct screaming at me, I veered onto the grass, letting the tall bushes conceal my car. The moment I killed the engine, a profound silence enveloped me. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just a weighted hush. Just a quick nap, I muttered, rubbing my eyes. 15 minutes, maybe 30. My phone read 11:22 p.m. as I locked the doors and reclined the seat. Sleep overcame me in seconds. I fell into a dark void, my dreams chaotic and tinged with anxiety. I vaguely recall images of twisted trees and half-glimpsed faces peering through my windows. It felt as though the forest itself had pressed up against the glass, forcing nightmares into my subconscious. A sudden, grating sound snapped me awake. Scratch, 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 metal on metal. My eyes flew open, heart thrumming. The clock read 11:50 p.m. The sound ceased the moment I stirred. My surroundings were dark, the interior of the car illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the bushes. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the area through the windshield. Nothing. Just layered darkness. Scratch. Silence. I held my breath, straining to listen. Had it been a tree branch scraping the car, or an animal sniffing around? My mind played through every rational explanation, but something about the sound felt deliberate, as if a claw or nail was carefully testing the metal. After a moment of paralysis, exhaustion won out again. My eyelids drooped, and I drifted off, convinced it was a stray raccoon or some other critter. The second time I woke, the clock read 12:40 a.m. The scratching had returned, louder and more insistent, a shriek of metal on metal that rattled my teeth. Unlike before, it didn't stop when I stirred, it continued, forcing my chest to tighten in mounting panic. I flipped on the overhead light. The interior glowed weakly, revealing my own terrified reflection in the rearview mirror. The windows were fogged with condensation, limiting my view of whatever lurked outside. My heart pounded like a war drum, my hands shaking. Was it a person? An animal? Or something else? Desperate to see, I wiped the rear window with my sleeve. Through the smear, I caught the barest glimpse of movement at the tree line. A shape darted out of sight, too tall and too quick to be any animal I recognized. A primal terror gripped me. Could it be a prowler? A predator? I recalled urban legends about killer hitchhikers and hook-handed maniacs who lurked on deserted roads. But there was something about that shape, a fluidity in its movement, almost inhuman. No, I told myself. Don't give in to paranoia. Yet my rational mind couldn't chase away the image of those elongated limbs slinking back into the trees. Heart hammering, I sat there, deciding whether to flee immediately. My gut urged me to drive, but curiosity, foolish though it was, kept me still for a moment longer. Then, without warning, the radio crackled to life. That same static from before filled the car, but this time, it carried an undercurrent of faint voices. My hand hovered over the volume dial. Hello? I breathed, as if expecting a response. The static hissed, popping in and out. And then I heard it, my own name, whispered through the speakers in a warped, echoing tone. Name. Name. I can't properly describe the terror of hearing your name hissed by a disembodied voice over the radio at nearly 1 a.m. in the middle of nowhere. My blood turned to ice. I yanked the keys in the ignition, forcibly starting the engine. The static rose to a crescendo, and I floored the accelerator, plowing through the bushes and back onto the road. My headlights cast dancing shadows across the asphalt, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a pair of glowing eyes in the rearview mirror. Terror fueled me. The road unwound ahead, my speedometer needle climbing higher than was safe on a winding, tree-lined route. But I didn't care, I had to escape. Just as I rounded a bend, my headlights illuminated a car on the shoulder with its driver's side door open wide. It was parked at a precarious angle, as though the driver had slammed on the brakes and leapt out in a hurry. Ordinarily, I'd slow down and check if someone needed help. But not tonight. Alarm bells rang in my skull. My instincts screamed that this was a trap or a worse scenario altogether. Nonetheless, curiosity made me ease off the gas for just a moment, enough to peer inside. Empty. No one behind the wheel or in the passenger seat. But here's the chilling part, the interior lights were on, and I could see personal items, a phone charger, a half-full water bottle, even a child's stuffed toy, strewn across the front seat. It looked like whoever had been driving had vanished into thin air. Then, I glanced in my rearview mirror. A figure sprinted around the corner, heading straight for me. His face twisted in fury or desperation, maybe both, and his voice carried through the still night air. "Hey! Hey, you! Get the hell out of your car! Now!" He flailed his arms, his movements frantic, disjointed, as if something might be chasing him. I didn't wait to find out. My foot mashed the accelerator, tires squealing against the pavement. Through the mirror, I saw the man's silhouette shrink as I sped on. I thought the worst was over. How naive. The road took on a nightmarish quality, the air thick with tension. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and every nerve in my body was on high alert. I realized I was breathing in short gasps. I had to calm down, or I risked losing control of the car entirely. But the deeper I drove into the woods, the more everything felt wrong. The trees seemed older, their trunks twisted as if tortured by centuries of storms. Branches hung overhead, forming a skeletal arch. My headlights illuminated patches of gnarled bark that seemed to bristle with faces in the grain, illusions that vanished the moment I blinked. At one point, the forest opened briefly to a lowland swamp, and an overpowering stench of decay assailed me. It smelled like rotting carcasses and stagnant water, a noxious miasma that seeped in through the vents. Fog clung to the ground, swirling in ephemeral shapes that resembled grasping hands. I nearly gagged from the odor. How had I never noticed a swamp in this region before? Was I even on the right road? The radio crackled again, making me jump. Out of reflex, I smacked the power button, silencing it. If there was any more ghostly whispering, I didn't want to hear it. My phone still showed no service, no data, no bars. As far as the outside world was concerned, I might as well not exist. Time lost meaning in that dreadful place. The clock said it was past 1 a.m., but it could have been minutes or hours since I fled the scratching. Each curve in the road revealed new horrors, sometimes an old sign that pointed to a town I'd never heard of, other times a glimpse of flickering light far off in the trees. More than once, I thought I saw silhouettes moving just beyond my headlights. At 1:15 a.m., I slowed upon seeing debris scattered across the road, a shattered windshield, shards of metal. Could there have been an accident? My heart pounded with renewed anxiety. As I crept around the wreckage, my headlights locked onto the shape of a deer carcass. But it was unlike any deer I'd seen. The body was shriveled, as if drained, and its eyes were two black pits, reflecting no light at all. My stomach churned. Drive, I told myself. Just drive. So I did, weaving around the debris. Behind me, the deer's remains receded into darkness, but that unsettling image was etched into my memory. There was something off about it, a sense of a silent, watchful presence around the corpse. Soon after, the road sloped upward, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this cursed forest would finally end. But as I reached the crest, my headlights revealed a single figure standing by the guardrail. It wore a tattered coat, the face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. Instinctively, I braked. The figure lifted its head. Two pinpoints of light glimmered where its eyes should have been. In a blink, it was gone, vanishing so abruptly it was as if it had never been there at all. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure I'd burst. "Keep going," I repeated, my new mantra. By 1:40 a.m., my initial burst of adrenaline began to wane, replaced by a gnawing dread and the return of crippling fatigue. My hands, slick with sweat, threatened to slip on the wheel. The forest thickened around the road again, branches entwining overhead so densely they formed a near tunnel. The darkness here was absolute, broken only by my feeble headlights. That was when the whispering started. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling leaves. But as I slowed down for a hairpin turn, I realized it was voices, or something approximating them. Low, sibilant murmurs that slid through the cracked windows. My scalp prickled. I turned the radio off, still off, no static. The voices seemed to come from outside. Were the trees themselves whispering? The notion was absurd. Yet, each gust of wind carried an eerie hush, like words spoken by countless throats in unison. Some fragments almost sounded like language, but not one I recognized. My pulse raced, a caged animal in my chest. I couldn't bear to stop again, and I couldn't decipher the voices. The only solution was to keep driving. But the road took a cruel turn, figuratively and literally. My headlights illuminated a dead end, blocked by a massive fallen tree. I stomped on the brakes, the car skidding a few yards before stopping inches from the trunk. I cursed out loud. A detour. The forest was forcing me to backtrack. As I shifted into reverse, I thought I saw movement in the rearview mirror, dark shapes weaving between the trees. Panic surged, and I whipped the car around, determined to find another route before those shapes got any closer. I retraced my path, adrenaline surging every time I recognized an earlier landmark. But something was off. Landmarks appeared out of order, as if the forest had rearranged itself. I'd drive past a mossy boulder I was sure I'd seen miles back, only to find a rusted road sign I'd passed earlier materializing ahead of me moments later. Time and distance lost their usual meaning, replaced by a twisted geometry that made no sense. The temperature dropped noticeably. My breath formed puffs of condensation in the car, despite the fact it was supposed to be a mild evening. I turned on the heater, but only cold air blasted out. Then the headlights flickered. A jolt of terror stabbed through me. My car was faltering, or was something else interfering? At last, I spotted a break in the trees, a side road branching off to the left. Desperate to escape the loop, I took it without hesitation. This new road was narrower, with even fewer signs of human presence. Gravel crunched beneath my tires. The forest parted, revealing rolling swamplands under a thin veil of moonlight. The stench of stagnant water returned, stronger than before, making me gag. Fog hung low over the swamp, drifting in tendrils that curled around the trees. My car's headlights caught swirling motes of dust and insects, but sometimes the beams seemed to reflect off something else, fleeting outlines that disappeared as soon as I focused on them. Halfway through the swampy stretch, a shape skittered across the road on all fours. My eyes widened in horror. It was larger than a dog, its limbs grotesquely elongated. The way it moved defied normal anatomy, hips and shoulders contorting. It paused to stare at me, eyes reflecting orange in my headlights. In a heartbeat, it sprang back into the mist, leaving me with a trembling conviction that something unnatural prowled these wetlands. My mind raced. Could it be a trick of the light? A local predator with a deformity? But how to explain those twisted limbs, the unnerving intelligence in its posture? I didn't dare linger. My foot pressed the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. Don't slow down, I reminded myself. Don't give these things a chance to catch up. At long last, a wooden sign loomed out of the fog, its lettering faded and nearly illegible. I squinted to read it, Willow Bend Rest Area, 1 mile. Relief momentarily dimmed my terror. A rest area meant lights, maybe a phone or even other people. I clung to that hope like a lifeline. The rest stop emerged around a bend in the swamp. A single flickering lamp cast one light on a cracked parking lot. There was a battered building, likely restrooms or a visitor center, and a soda machine that looked half-rusted. No other cars. Despite the desolation, it felt like a possible sanctuary. I parked under the lamp, grateful for the meter glow. Turning off the engine, I sat for a moment, listening. Apart from my own ragged breathing, silence. I glanced at the door to the building. It stood ajar, darkness yawning within. I mustered courage and stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a slap. My senses prickled. The ground squelched with each step, muddy, wet, as though the swamp was creeping in. A rotting smell wafted from the open doorway. I wanted to check inside for a phone or any sign of life, but my stomach churned at that stench. The payphone on the exterior wall beckoned like a beacon of hope. Its receiver hung from a frayed cord. I picked it up. Static. My breath caught. I tried dialing 911. Nothing but a faint hiss. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a voice whispered my name through the static, the same warped tone I'd heard on the radio. My throat constricted in sheer panic. I slammed the receiver back into place. A battered bulletin board next to the phone displayed missing persons flyers, water-stained and peeling. One photograph showed a smiling family of 3, labeled missing in bold letters. Another depicted a young man in a college hoodie, date of disappearance nearly a year ago. My skin crawled at the realization these were travelers, people like me, who had vanished in these woods. Suddenly, movement flickered at the corner of my vision. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing except the gloom. Go, my instincts roared. Leave now. I dashed back to my car, fumbled with the keys, and roared out of the lot, uncertain if I'd see a safe road ahead or plunge deeper into the labyrinth. I forced my car back onto the narrow highway, the swamp diminishing behind me. It was now pushing 2 a.m. My entire body felt wrung out, but fear kept my mind wired. The darkness seemed less complete here, trees receding slightly. I clung to optimism that maybe I was nearing civilization. Then, in the rearview mirror, I glimpsed headlights, another car behind me, distant but closing fast. Relief washed over me. Another traveler. Maybe I wasn't alone. I slowed to let the vehicle catch up, hoping to wave them down. But as the headlights approached, I realized something was amiss. They swerved wildly, as if the driver were intoxicated or wrestling with the wheel. Concern overrode fear, and I tapped my brakes. But in the split second before I could pull over, the headlights blinked out, vanished, leaving the road behind me deserted. My heart lurched. There had been no side road to turn onto, no place for the car to disappear. The mirror showed only darkness, occasionally illuminated by my own brake lights. A shudder ran through me. Had I hallucinated? My reflection stared back, pale and trembling. Then, as I accelerated again, I noticed something in that reflection, a faint silhouette in the back seat. I whipped around, fear surging to my throat. The back seat was empty. Had it just been a trick of the light? But when I looked again into the mirror, for the briefest moment, I saw a face, gaunt and ashen, eyes wide and unblinking, looming behind me. I screamed and nearly swerved off the road. By the time I steadied the car, the face was gone, if it had ever been there to begin with. By now, a primal instinct told me that if I didn't leave these woods soon, I never would. The sense of being hunted, or perhaps lured, was undeniable. Every new mile felt like stepping deeper into an open grave. At 2:20 a.m., the trees began to thin out, revealing a faint glow on the horizon, city lights. My chest constricted in relief. Just a bit further, and I could rejoin the main highway, call the police, or find a motel. Anything to escape the clutches of this cursed backroad. Yet, the forest had one last trick in store. A final bend in the road, sharper than the others, forced me to slow down. My high beams swept across a figure sprawled at the roadside. It was the same man I'd seen earlier, the one who'd screamed for me to get out of the car. His clothes were torn, and his face was contorted in terror. His eyes met mine, wild with desperation. I hesitated for half a second. Did he need help? But then he lunged toward me, spittle flying from his lips as he roared, "It won't let you leave. You can't escape. Get out of the car, or it will devour us both." Something in his voice, or maybe the madness etched on his features, ignited a burst of self-preservation in me. I slammed the gas. He pounded on my hood, leaving handprints in the mud, but I kept going. Through the windshield, I caught a glimpse of him in my headlights as he staggered backward, a look of despair on his face. I refused to stop. I had to survive. Within minutes, the forest spat me out onto a major road, bright streetlights glaring against my windshield. The abrupt transition to normalcy was jarring. Cars passed by in either direction, oblivious to the nightmare just a few miles behind them. My phone pinged with a notification, service restored. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:35 a.m. Only a couple of hours had passed since I left the reunion, but it felt like an eternity. I stopped at the first gas station I found, its fluorescent lights a harsh but welcome reprieve. My legs shook as I stumbled out of the car. The cashier eyed me warily as I grabbed bottled water and practically chugged it in front of the counter. I must have looked deranged, hair matted with sweat, eyes bloodshot, face pale. "Rough night?" the cashier asked, eyebrows raised. You have no idea," I croaked, voice trembling. I tried calling the police, but the adrenaline crash robbed me of coherent speech. Stammering about strange figures and possible missing persons, I sounded like a lunatic. The dispatcher took my statement, said they'd look into it, but I could hear the skepticism in their voice. When I tried to describe the unnatural aspects, the shape in the mirror, the ghostly headlights, I realized how insane it all sounded. After hanging up, I just sat there, leaning on the store's counter. The harsh overhead lights were my salvation, a barrier against the darkness. But I had to go home eventually. I had to face the night again, if only to drive the remaining distance. The last leg of the trip was blissfully uneventful. The highway was dotted with late-night truckers and a few other travelers. Streetlights, billboards, and the glow from rest stops made me feel safer, though a part of me expected some monstrous figure to step into my path at any moment. I arrived home close to 4 a.m., heart still hammering. My suburban neighborhood lay silent, windows dark. As I pulled into my driveway, a wave of relief washed over me. I was safe. The nightmares were behind me. Except, the instant I shut off the engine, I heard it, a faint scratch along the side of my car. My lungs constricted in terror. Summoning every ounce of courage, I forced the door open and stepped outside. I circled the car, shining my phone's flashlight. The paint on the passenger door was marred by 3 long scratches, fresh and glinting. They ran parallel, almost like claw marks. I raced inside, locking every bolt. Exhaustion hammered at me, but fear kept me awake. I sat on my couch, phone in hand, staring at the wall clock. I had to work in a few hours, but sleep was out of the question. When daylight finally seeped through the windows, I felt a fraction calmer, as though the sunlight banished whatever horrors lurked in the night. But the scratches on my car remained. The memory of that man's scream, the shape in the swamp, and the voices in the static haunted me. I called in sick, unable to muster the strength to pretend everything was normal. Over the next few days, I scoured the internet for any mention of disappearances or strange sightings along that old highway. I found scattered reports, accounts of travelers who vanished without a trace, local legends about ghostly figures in the forest. One story mentioned an ancient presence said to dwell in the wetlands, luring lost souls. Another recounted a road that changes at night, leading unwary drivers into a realm of shadows. I tried following up with the police about the abandoned car. They offered no new information. When I mentioned the man who'd screamed at me, they grew dismissive, suggesting I might have been a victim of a near hijacking or carjacking attempt. But that didn't explain the paranormal events, nor the monstrous silhouettes in the swamp. Sleep became my enemy. Each time I dozed, nightmares consumed me, visions of those pale eyes in the rearview mirror, and the ragged whisper of my name over the radio. I took to leaving lights on in every room, double-checking all my windows at night, and jumping at the slightest noise. It felt like I'd brought a piece of that forest back with me, an inescapable shadow that stalked me. A part of me sought closure. I considered driving back in the daytime, searching for clues. but the mere thought of returning brought waves of nausea. My rational mind insisted that the road in daylight would be harmless, just another stretch of asphalt. Yet the dread was too real, too potent. Weeks turned into months. I functioned on autopilot at work, my mind perpetually replaying that horrifying night. Friends noticed my jumpiness. I dodged their questions or offered half-truths. I had a scare on the road, or I nearly got robbed. Telling them the full extent only earned me concerned looks or polite dismissals. No one believed in whispering static or phantom silhouettes that vanish in the blink of an eye. At times, I wondered if I was losing my sanity. Had stress and exhaustion warped my perception? Yet, the scratches on my car remained a physical reminder that something real had happened. I had never believed in the supernatural before, but that night shattered my certainty. Late one evening, while scrolling through online forums about paranormal encounters, I found a thread describing experiences eerily similar to mine. People spoke of a desolate route through ancient woods, radio static that seemed to call out, unexplained figures crossing the road. One user wrote that they'd seen a half-human, half-bestial creature stalking the shoulder, though they escaped before it could do more than snarl at them. Another claimed they woke in the driver's seat with no memory of how they'd arrived home, convinced they'd been possessed by something in the forest. The chorus of accounts comforted me slightly, validating that I wasn't alone. Yet it also horrified me. These incidents span decades. One post shared a newspaper clipping from the 1950s, travelers missing on Old Pines Road, bodies never found. A local detective had once tried investigating. He disappeared as well. The region gained a sinister reputation, but official records were scant. It was as if authorities wanted to bury the truth, or perhaps they simply had no explanation. Reading these stories triggered flashbacks of the ephemeral voice that whispered my name. I recalled how the wind sounded like voices in the trees, how the radio hissed with malevolent intelligence. If so many had encountered it, why hadn't the government closed off the road? The only answer seemed to be that it was too remote, too easy to ignore. Or perhaps, more ominously, no one in power wanted to acknowledge what truly resided there. Eventually, I sold the car, unable to bear the taint of those scratches. Every time I looked at them, my heart raced, and I remembered the scraping in the dark. My new vehicle brought little solace, though. I still avoided late-night drives whenever possible, and if forced by circumstance, I stuck exclusively to well-lit highways. Even then, I'd catch myself checking the rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting a gaunt face to loom up behind me. Sleep remained elusive. My dreams were plagued by the memory of that man shrieking for me to stop. In my nightmares, I sometimes did stop, stepping out to confront him, only to be dragged into the shadows by an unseen force. Other nights, the swamp creature with elongated limbs appeared in my bedroom, scuttling across the ceiling. I'd wake drenched in sweat, the echo of that hideous scraping noise lingering in my ears. Friends and family, worried about my changed demeanor, urged me to seek professional help. I tried therapy, but how do you explain that your trauma stems from a possibly supernatural encounter on a deserted road? My therapist offered standard lines about stress and the power of the subconscious mind. While the sessions helped me cope with insomnia, they did little to dispel the creeping dread that my experience was all too real. 2 years have passed, and I'm no closer to making sense of that night. The nightmares still visit, though less frequently. I've developed a cautious routine: no driving after 10 p.m., no ignoring that instinctive fear that curls in my gut. I plan trips meticulously, mapping out every stop, ensuring I never again need to pull over on a deserted stretch. People ask if I've faced any more unexplained phenomena. Mostly, no. But sometimes, a radio will hiss at just the right pitch, and it's like I'm back there in that car, the voice almost calling my name. Or, on foggy mornings, I'll think I see a silhouette on all fours in the neighbor's yard, only to blink and find it gone. I never discovered the fate of that screaming man or the occupant of the abandoned car. Perhaps they escaped, or perhaps they fell prey to whatever prowls those woods. The missing persons flyers remain unsolved mysteries, silent testimonies to the forest's hunger. From time to time, I find myself browsing news sites for any mention of the region, any new disappearance that might confirm my suspicions. Yet there's an odd scarcity of reports, as though each victim's story vanishes along with them. Or maybe most people never live to share what they saw. I'm one of the lucky ones, if you can call living with perpetual fear lucky. Now, whenever someone asks for travel advice, I share my cautionary tale, stripped of its most outlandish details so I don't sound insane. Whatever you do, don't pull over on a deserted road at night, I say. It's not worth the risk. Some laugh it off. Others raise an eyebrow. They don't understand that the real moral is deeper. There are places in the world where the normal rules fail, where old powers or hungry spirits linger, waiting for wanderers to drop their guard. My story isn't meant to be an urban legend. It's a personal account of a horror that could, and does, happen, in one form or another, to unsuspecting travelers. The scariest part isn't the fleeting shapes or the mysterious injuries. It's the sense of being trapped, of roads twisting in impossible ways, of time itself warping to keep you locked in a labyrinth with no clear way out. Sometimes, I wonder if I merely grazed the surface, if the forest had darker depths that it chose not to reveal to me. Could there be entire communities or cults dwelling deeper in the swamps, worshipping ancient entities that feed on lost souls? The fragments of my nightmares hint at such possibilities, though I pray they remain fantasy. A few months back, I gathered the courage to watch a dashcam video posted online, footage from a driver who had partially recorded an encounter on a rural road. The camera showed a shape darting across the lanes, a shrill scratching sound reverberating through the audio. Then the feed cut out, replaced by static. The driver's YouTube account went dormant afterward. Comments ranged from clever hoax to genuine proof of the paranormal. I recognized the fear in that driver's frantic breathing. It matched my own from that night. I don't know what's worse, believing these monstrous events are real, or living in denial while others unwittingly stumble into the same danger. I still have nightmares, but they no longer paralyze me. They serve as a grim reminder that not every shadow is harmless, and not every quiet place is peaceful. Would I do anything differently if I could relive that night? Yes. I would have stayed with my family, safe under a leaky farmhouse roof, even if it meant risking my boss's displeasure at missing work. Any inconvenience is preferable to crossing paths with the unknown. To you, the reader of this confession, I offer this final plea: don't let fatigue lull you into risking your life on a desolate byway. The next time you consider pulling over on a moonless stretch, remember my story. If you hear scratching outside your window or see shapes that defy logic, heed the warning. Drive. Escape. Because if you don't, you might end up like the missing souls who left nothing behind but a car on the roadside and a few unanswered questions. I survived, but survival came with a heavy cost, a lifetime of insomnia, paranoia, and the unshakable certainty that one day, if I'm not vigilant, the darkness might find me again. And this time, it might not let me leave.